So Matt, suppose that the initial conditions of the universe spelled out made by God with love in every human language. And suppose that we had sort of definitive scientific proof that this was not the byproduct of a limited simulator. Like, the only two possibilities were that this was a byproduct purely of chance, or that it was the byproduct of an all-powerful God. Would you say that that was evidence that there was a God?
I have no idea. You've created a fictional scenario that is used as an intuition pump to deceive people into accepting something that is unwarranted. And so please show me in the constants how it is written with love from God in every language. And until then, you have invented a fictional science fiction scenario in order to say, if this happened, we'd have good reason to believe in God.
You're about to see one of the most famous atheists on YouTube debate Matthew Adelstein, a theist, on whether or not the fine-tuning of the universe to allow for life to be possible is evidence for God. Now, I love this debate for a couple of reasons. One, the theist who believes in God knocks down one after another of common atheist responses and objections to fine-tuning arguments for God's existence. It's a real masterclass in that sense. But then number two, he also uses a hypothetical that I think shows an inconsistency in Matt's response to fine-tuning arguments that demonstrates that he probably should accept them. We'll take a look at that in just a few moments, but let's jump in.
So Matt, suppose that the initial conditions of the universe spelled out made by God with love in every human language. And suppose that we had sort of definitive scientific proof that this was not the byproduct of a limited simulator. Like, the only two possibilities were that this was a byproduct purely of chance, or that it was the byproduct of an all-powerful God. Would you say that that was evidence that there was a God?
I have no idea. In that particular hypothetical scenario, which, by the way, is not remotely what we have, I think it could be completely understandable why people would reasonably conclude that that was a message from a God. I don't understand the in every possible language. I mean, it seems like...
Sorry, I said in every human language.
Okay, I don't know how it's possible to say. So individually, there's like a billion statements there covering every language and dialect, and they all say created with love from God.
Yeah,
then at a minimum,
you can imagine it's in really small writing.
Sure, at a minimum, that would make it seem that it's rational to conclude that there is a being capable of doing that, and that may be sufficiently close to godlike for us to not care whether it's the Omnimax God or not. But in any case, it would be really, really incredible evidence that it's more likely that there's a being capable of doing that. Whether or not it's a God is a separate thing.
Okay, and so the reason you would say that it's reasonable to conclude there's a being that can do that is because the odds of that happening by chance are super low, and the odds of it happening if there was a being who wanted to create it are super high, right? That's sort of the broad picture.
We can't calculate. Okay, but it seems, given the information we have, that it is less likely for that to happen by chance than by intent. However, we only have one occurrence. And so I don't know how we determined what the odds are for any of this with one occurrence.
Okay, so follow up. And how's that scenario different from fine-tuning? Like, in the case of the initial conditions being that way, you'd say, look, it's so unlikely it would be that way by chance. That because even though there's no reason to expect that a God would definitely do it that way, you think maybe there's a reason a God would do it that way, and it's so unlikely to happen by chance that a designer doing it is the best explanation. So why is that different from fine-tuning, where the odds of it happening by chance are on the order of 1 in Google?
Yeah, so the reason that a message written in every human language is less likely. Let me phrase your question correctly. You're saying, why is that more acceptable than the fine-tuning that you see to conclude in a God?
Yep.
Because human languages are our inventions and are the result of our progress. And so to have them written in human language from the beginning of time is a completely different category of things than having life evolve to fit the physical properties of the universe in which it inhabits.
Now, in just a few moments, we're going to see why Matt Dillahunty walks right into a big inconsistency. But first, notice his response to the hypothetical. If it were written made by God, though that would be ridiculously improbable, and maybe that's not even the right term, Dillahunty thinks it doesn't compare to fine-tuning arguments because those human languages wouldn't be written until much later, billions of years later, and as a result, it would be impossible for them to be there from the beginning unless there was some intelligence behind it. We'll see what Adelstein thinks about that in just a minute, but first, Dillahunty's going to try and push on this notion that perhaps life could have emerged even if the fundamental constants had been different. Adelstein presses Dillahunty to put his money where his mouth is on that suggestion.
You could change some of the constants, you could change things and have a different universe crop up where a different set of life forms would be considering how the universe was created for them. The difference between your fine-tuning and this hypothetical message is that your fine-tuning is predicated on the notion that we are the goal rather than what we are, which is what can evolve in the system.
So, Matt, what are some of the examples of fine-tuning that are cited by theists that if the constants were to be changed, do you think you could get a different kind of life? Like, for example, do you think that about the cosmological constant? Do you think that about the Higgs mass?
I have no idea. I'm not even convinced that those things could. I'm sorry, what?
Well, sorry. So what you just said was that, look, if you change the constants, you could get life arising under different conditions, and then there's different kinds of life. Yeah, and then you said there's different kinds of life. Then they would be wondering to themselves, "Oh, it's so surprising we got them." So I'm asking, which constants do you think you could change where you'd get different kinds of life? Do you think that about the cosmological constant? Do you think that about the Higgs mass? Which one is this true of?
I don't know that it's true of any of them. I was presenting a hypothetical that if in some other universe with different content, in a different universe with those constants being changed some, it may be the case that something else exists and evolves and thinks that they are the special creation. I have no idea what they could change or what kind of life. It's not my field at all. It's not.
Yeah. So
okay.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Yeah. And sorry to cut you off. There were points when I thought you were done, but I think there's a slight delay. So I think that might be right. Yeah. So I don't think that's plausible actually for the specific instances of fine tuning. So take the cosmological constant, for example, which governs how rapidly the universe expands. If the cosmological constant were a little bit weaker, then much less than 1 millisecond after the Big Bang, everything would have collapsed in on itself. If it were a little bit stronger, everything would have flown apart much less than 1 millisecond after the Big Bang started. And the only values of the cosmological constant that give rise to complex structures that don't result in everything imploding or in everything flying apart are values of the cosmological constant that fall in a portion of the possible range that's about 1 part in 10 to the power of 120 of the values you could take on. So my question for you is this. Matt, do you think that if everything flew apart after less than a millisecond, that you could get a stable form of life?
I have no idea. That's not relevant and not my area of expertise. And the way that you're framing this is very problematic because I've already acknowledged that I'm not convinced those constants could have been any other way.
This is so good. Dillahunty tries a common suggestion, but Adelstein holds his feet to the fire. So Dillahunty changes posture and says, well, maybe those fundamental constants couldn't be different. How does Adelstein respond?
You're giving a few different replies to fine-tuning. So the first one you gave was you suggested that life could have arisen under different conditions. I think that's clearly not true for the reason I just described.
That's not what I was saying about this reality. I'm not saying that about this reality at all. You're talking about if the constants had been different. And I specifically said that I don't know that the constants could be different, but in a hypothetical...
So your second reply was you say, you don't know that the constants could be different. Okay, so in the made by God case, imagine a person said the following. They said, look, it's not at all surprising that the constants spell out made by God in every human language. I'm not even convinced that they could spell out anything else. Would you say that that's a convincing reply in a world like that?
No.
So how's that different from the constants being finely tuned?
Because all of the language elements that would only occur and exist billions of years after the formation existed at the formation. That is fundamentally different. It's not like the constants of the universe dictated Spanish necessarily, but even if hard determinism were true and the constants of the universe specifically led to Spanish is not evidence that it could have been any other, or the absence of Spanish wouldn't be evidence that it occurred any other way.
Right. So you're saying that it's very improbable that the things that would be the initial conditions would happen to correspond to any written human language. And I would say, yeah, but I also think it's really improbable that the cosmological constant, out of all of the values that one could imagine it taking on, would take on a value that happens to be one of the minuscule portions of possible cosmological constant values that give rise to the formation of complex structures. Now, you
Except
say
that,
you said
except
now what
that,
you said
that is
in
the only, except that is the only way any of us have this conversation.
Okay, well, so that's a different reply. So now you're raising the kind of anthropic bias reply. Okay, so I'll address that, but I just flag, that's a different reply from saying that the constants couldn't have been different. So I think the problem with the constants couldn't have been different reply is that if we bought that reply, we would also buy that reply in the scenario where the initial conditions spelled out made by God, because you could similarly say, look, that's not improbable because they can't be anything else.
No, because the constants must exist before there can be the language that results from it in the long term, even in a hard deterministic universe. You've created a fictional scenario that is used as an intuition pump to deceive people into accepting something that is unwarranted. And so please show me in the constants how it is written with love from God in every language. And until then, you have invented a fictional science fiction scenario in order to say, if this happened, we'd have good reason to believe in God. And even in that scenario, I was correct in pointing out that if that happened, we would have good reason to conclude that something intentionally did that. Because at the beginning of the universe, Spanish, Latin, French, English, none of that exists. And so that is specifically predicting something that cannot exist at 5 minutes after the universe existed.
Right. But so both the constants and the initial conditions of the universe existed at the start of the universe. In both cases, there's a value that you could imagine them taking on, where it's very unlikely that they would take them on.
Okay, so back to the made by God hypothetical and how Dillahunty walked right into what I think is a big inconsistency. Dillahunty thinks that without intent, made by God couldn't be written in every human language from the earliest moments of the universe because those represent languages that would be invented by humans later on. So it would be impossible. But it's actually not impossible that certain markings would come to exist that just happen to spell out made by God in every human language. It's just ridiculously improbable, so much so that you should think there was intent behind it. Similarly, Adelstein wants to say it's not impossible that the universe would be finely tuned for life if there is no intent behind it. It's just that it's ridiculously unlikely, so much so that you should accept the argument from fine tuning. If Matt Dillahunty thinks that made by God would be good reason to believe there was intent or a designer behind the universe, then he should be consistent and think that the fine tuning is good reason to think that a designer was involved. But there's a lot more to say. If you'd like to see me personally debate Matt Dillahunty on stage in Waco, Texas, then click the link that's on the screen right now.